Okay, let's start again. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this very important webinar. My name is Hannah Song. I'm from the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, NKDB, and I'm honored to be your moderator today. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being interpreted into Korean to ensure accessibility for a broader audience. The second session in particular will have Korean speakers, so we remind you to click the interpretation button at the very bottom to make sure that you get the right channel. 안녕하세요. 북한인권정보센터 송한나입니다. 저희 오늘 웨비나는 한영 통역, 동시 통역으로 진행이 되고 있는데요. 밑에 보시면 통역 시그널 심볼이 있습니다. 통역 버튼을 누르면 한국어 채널을 선택을 하시면 저희 특히 일부 세션은 영어로 진행이 되고 있어가지고 한국어로도 통역될 수 있는 거를 들을 수 있습니다. Okay, great. Now let's get started. We understand that there is a lot happening globally right now, especially in South Korea. We're just recovering from martial law to the recent impeachment in Seoul. And we also know there is a lot going on in Syria and in Gaza. Despite all of these challenges, we still felt like it was essential to create this space. Today's discussion represents not only an exchange of ideas, but hopefully the beginning of solidarity for those impacted by the war in Ukraine between stakeholders in South Korea, Ukraine, EU member states, and beyond. North Korea's involvement in Russia's war against Ukraine through munition supplies and forced conscription has drawn international scrutiny, giving rise to debates on North Korea's responsibility as a state for facilitating Russia's aggression and individual criminal responsibility of North Korean soldiers. There is still so much that is unknown. Over the weekend, Ukraine's military intelligence agency claimed that North Korean troops fighting alongside Russian forces in Kursk killed 8 members of a Russian unit in a friendly fire attack. And earlier that day, President Zelensky reported that a significant number of North Korean troops had joined Russian assault operations in the Kursk region. It's been difficult to verify a lot of the information that is out there. However, what we do know is that North Korean soldiers have indeed been dispatched and that there has been a very limited attention given to the plight of the North Korean soldiers themselves, especially from a human rights perspective. These individuals are often forcibly conscripted with no autonomy. They're both participants as well as victims of their conflict. The experiences highlight the need for critical gaps in protections under international humanitarian law and the need for a comprehensive accountability frameworks that addresses both perpetration and victimhood. And this webinar seeks to fill this gap by examining the implications for and protections of North Korean soldiers within the conflict. Now, some of you are familiar with our work, but for those of you who are not, the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, NKDB, is a Seoul-based documentation organization that works closely with victims for accountability purposes. We manage the largest repository on North Korean human rights globally, and our database comprises of over 87,000 cases of North Korean human rights violations. For us, a North Korean human rights case not only includes the cases of the human rights violations being committed against North Koreans inside the DPRK territory by their own government, but also in the case that they are perpetrators themselves or victims themselves overseas, which is why we have taken such an interest in this issue due to the dual role that the North Korean soldiers could potentially take. I'm excited that we are co-hosting this webinar with my colleagues from Uprights, a nonprofit organization based in The Hague in the Netherlands that uses their experience in international humanitarian, criminal, and human rights law to develop and support meaningful partnerships. As well as we have our colleagues from the Public Interest Journalism Lab and the Reckoning Project, an initiative of Ukrainian and international reporters, analysts, and lawyers aimed at eradicating impunity and bringing justice. We will have 4 speakers for each session. Each speaker will have about 7 minutes for the initial remarks before we open it up for a Q&A and discussion at the end of each section, at the end of each segment. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into the Q&A box and we will try and address as many as possible. And as you may have noticed, this session is being recorded and we will share the recording with all participants after the event. So let's get started. The first session will lay out some facts. What is going on in Ukraine? How are North Korean soldiers implicated? And what does this all mean in the world of international humanitarian law and also possible accountability? Our first speaker is Natalia from the Reckoning Project and Public Interest Journalism Lab. Natalia is a prominent Ukrainian journalist and author specializing in conflict reporting. She's the founder and CEO of the Public Interest Journalism Lab, which promotes constructive discussion around complex social issues. After the full-scale Russian invasion, Natalia pivoted to frontline media reporting and with her team co-founded the Reckoning Project, Ukraine Testifies, which documents war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russia. Natalia, the floor is yours.
Hi, hello everybody. I'm there also to be useful to anybody who is interested in the topic, and particularly we hope to explain what's really going on for our Korean colleagues and counterparts and answer all the questions. But to give a brief, account of what's going on regarding the war crimes, the crimes against humanity committed in the Russian war against Ukraine, I'll start with some figures. So the official, we talk to direct survivors and witnesses of the war crimes, but of course it's a limited number. The general prosecutors of Ukraine lists that there are 142,000 incidents of the war crimes registered, when 13,000 civilians have been killed and further 25,000 have been injured. These are the official figures, and Ukraine it's considered that Ukraine has identified 700 suspects, filed over 500 indictments, and secured convictions for 133 war criminals. What we can say as the people dealing with the war crimes documentation, we're trying to speak mainly to the people whom hadn't been interviewed by the Ukrainian law enforcement, and there are a lot. So we can say that the figure can be higher. And it's all kind of the breaches of the Geneva Convention, missile strikes, attacks on the infrastructure, deportation of the Ukrainian children, but also tortures, abduction, executions, crimes against environment, literally everything. But what I want to stress is that we started to this work since March 2022, and working with analysts and lawyers who are apparently also Syrian, are international, and looking, from very holistic perspective on what's going on, we can say that it's not an aberration. It's not about one particular platoon. The people were executed and are tortured in quite a similar way. Was it the March 2022? Was it summer 2023?
2년, 그리고 여름 2023년, 그리고 오늘날 저희가 이야기를 들었을 때도 굉장히 다른 상황들이 많습니다. 미사일에 대한 그런 여러 가지 공격이나 다른 범행들이 많이 일어나고 있습니다. 지금으로서는 지금 주장되고 있는 그런 범죄들이죠. 지금 현재 전쟁이 민간인을 상대로 어떤 식으로 지금 체계적으로 지금 이루어지고 있는지 저희 분석가와 지금 많은 변호사들이 이야기를 하고 있습니다만, 지금 이미 점령당한 그 지역에 있어서 특히 이런 부분이 중요합니다. 지금 사실 민간인은 보호를 해야 되는데 이게 병원, 학교를 비롯한 이런 시설을 지키기가 굉장히 어렵습니다. 일부러 타겟을 하고 있기 때문에 이런 패턴들을 계속해서 보고 있고, 그래서 러시아의 그런 활동들을 시리아에서의 체치니아에서 병원을 공격했던 그런 행위들과 저희가 비교해서 보고 있습니다. 그래서 러시아 군대는 일반적인 군대로 보면 안 됩니다. 지금 굉장히 체계적인 그런 시스템적인 레벨에서 그 많은 전쟁 범죄에 책임을 갖고 있는 군대입니다. 그래서 국제 그 범죄 법정에서도 많은 그런 체포에 대한 영장을 발부하기도 했습니다. 블라디미르 푸틴을 비롯해서 그 여러 아동 인권에 대한 여러 위법한 사례와 그 우크라이나 어린이들의 그 불법 납치, 이런 부분들이 2년 동안 굉장히 많이 자행이 되었습니다. 그리고 러시아의 그런 군대의 많은 고위 공직자들이 직접적으로 민간인에 대한 공격을 자행했다라고 하는 주장이 있습니다. 이거는 명백한 인도주의적 번제입니다. 그리고 예를 들어서 지금 기존에 있었던 여러 흑해에서의 공군 내 흑해 함대의 굉장히 높은 고위직 인사들이 연루가 되어 있습니다. 그리고 러시아 군대의 치프 오브 스태프 등도 지금 언급이 되고 있습니다. 러시아에서 지금 우크라이나를 완전히 파괴하고자 많은 일들을 자행하고 있는 가운데 북한에서 리더십이 정규 군대를 통해서 약간 그런 동맹의 차원으로 파병을 하고 있지 않고 실제로 그 군대에 파병을 하면서 전쟁에 대한 체포 영장이 발부되어 있는 군대로 지금 본인들의 병사들을 파병하고 있는 것입니다. 그리고 지금 현재 의심이 되고 있는 전쟁 범죄의 수준이 굉장히 충격적입니다. 그래서 북한의 이런 관여, 그리고 전체 웨비나에서 이런 부분에 대해서 이야기를 하고 있는데, 우크라이나의 그런 여러 정보기관에 따르면, 북한에서는 지금 이제 여러 가지 이제 군수물자를 보내기 시작했죠. 지금 2023년 여름부터 이런 행동들이 시작됐다고 보고 있습니다. 이와 관련해서 인식제고 등 이런 부분을 하는데, 그리고 국내 언론에서도 이런 부분을 부각시키는데 상당한 시간이 좀 걸렸는데요. 지금 탄도미사일을 비롯한 그런 물자를 지금 지난 10월부터 보낸 것으로 파악되고 있고요. 여러 조사에 따르면 실제로 21개의 사례들에 대한 조사가 진행이 되고 있습니다. 그래서 해당 미사일들이 우크라이나의 수도와 다른 우크라이나 도시에 사용이 됐다라고 하는 부분을 조사 중에 있습니다. 그래서 굉장히 적대적인 공격으로 24명이 목숨을 잃고 115명이 부상을 입었습니다. 그래서 지금 현재 관련된 조사는 지금 한 2달, 3달 내외에 굉장히 짧은 기간 동안에
till the end of February 2024. Since then, there were way more ballistic missiles of North Korean origin are used. So there is already involvement in North Korea. Yes, North Korean troops, we can verify, are now joined the Russian army. The information about that had been proliferating since end of summer and especially in early September. The Ukrainian military intelligence, were providing quite a clear data. Where are those soldiers based? And they were speaking about 12,000 of the potential North Korean soldiers joining the Russian army. There was a warning that by the end of October, early November, they will join the Russian army in the bordering Kursk region, where Ukraine is created a kind of a buffer zone to deter the Russian army. And it happened. So, in fact, the projection of the Ukrainian intelligence more or less were confirmed. But we are speaking on the day where there were also a lot of questions whether the North Korean army whether it would be the casualties from the North Korean army. Yes, it is the case. As of these 2 days ago on Saturday, there were not just confirmation by the Ukrainian president, by some of the Ukrainian military platoons. There was a video proliferated where there were 22 soldiers were killed from the Russian side, and some of them were North Koreans. It's sometimes hard to verify, but here I'm coming to the final point: what to do with that, and and something to understand about the nature of the warfare. Earlier, I listed the types of the usual kind of crimes, and we're looking at the crimes from the systematic, perspective on the command and control. So of course, it's a Russian leadership, but also it's about individual Russian officer committing crime. Yet, usually these are either keeping people in the detention centers, and I probably would speculate to say it's highly unlikely that the North Korean soldiers would be the ones who will be in charge of controlling the facility centers where the Ukrainian civilians under the occupation are abducted and tortured. It's hard to imagine why they would need a foreign troops for that. We know that they need, let's say, just soldiers for the attacks like they are doing. And also, as I said, a lot of crimes are committed by using precise ballistic missiles and this type of weapon against the civilian objects. The North Korean potentially are more or less used as of now as an infantry, as a ground troops. So what is happening now, it's more or less the legit actions for the armies to fight in the battlefield. But when I was briefly in Korea last month, and we were talking to some of you and some of the human rights activists, we really discussed that can potentially the North Korean soldiers defect? Should it be the initiatives to call for that? And I would say that unfortunately it's very difficult, because the nature of this warfare, it's kind of different. It's an artillery war, and today it's a pretty new war type of the drone warfare. So literally, when the troops will kind of be close to the Ukrainian position and the Ukrainian soldiers would be, it's possible to see those soldiers, what's happened, there would be casualties. So the potentially the soldiers, the North Korean soldiers would be just killed. It's that type of warfare. I'm not saying that there are no prisoners of war, but what I should stress that the best way to avoid these casualties among the North Korean soldiers is not letting them to be sent to the battlefield. It's already too late. If they're already in the battle, chances to in any way protect them are extremely low. I'm finishing with that. I also want to pass to my colleagues, but I would also stress that there is a complex situation with the exchange of the prisoners of war between Ukrainian and Russian army, but we also have the situation when the Ukrainian civilians who lived in the occupied territories by Russia since 2014, the territories we call the Donbas region and Luhansk region, they were also, some of them forcefully mobilized and conscripted to fight against Ukrainian army, especially during the first 2 years. Yes, they're Ukrainian citizens, but there was a very same situation. There was Ukrainian army is fighting those who are fighting against them. So quite a few of them were, I wouldn't have a number, killed. So it's really, we would understand that also among the soldiers fought in Russian army, there are also those of the Ukrainian origin who are forcefully detained. So it's not really, so it's very hard to differentiate. There is a different situation on how they are exchanged, because as we know, as of today, the Russian state isn't really very much eager to get them back. They don't care much about those people, so they stay in the Ukrainian detention centers. But there is no, let's say, unique attitude from the Ukrainian state to the soldiers, to any combatants fighting on the side of Russia. That's it from me, and hope it's kind of provided a general overview to start the discussion.
Thanks, Natalia. I think that was a great overview of what is currently happening on the ground and to deal with the issues that we're facing. I'll hand it over to our next speaker, Alexandra. Alexandra is the Executive Director for the Center for Civil Liberties. Alexandra has became professionally involved as a human rights defender at the Center for Civil Liberties in 2014, which she has since been responsible for the international advocacy of the results of the center's activities. The Center for Civil Liberties was awarded the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize, and today she will speak a little bit about the work that she has been doing and how she sees this current issue. Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Dear colleague, I'm really honored to be here. Thank you for having me. And today I want to put attention that point which exactly Natalia finished about situation with illegally detained people or prisoners of war. And that's really important that we need to mention and remember that this war started 2014. So when we speak about illegally detainee or political prisoning,
에 대해서 좀
that
더
started
말씀을
from
드리겠습니다.
first years of occupation of Crimea. Same like
크림
war crimes at
반도를
the
점령한
Donbass. So
이후부터
now we
계속
have a
이어진
pattern
이슈입니다.
which
새로운
exactly
이슈가
started from
아닙니다.
2014.
돈바스에 또
This
이어져서
pattern
계속
it's
이러한 전쟁포로
absolutely
이슈가
don't have any understandable system of law where you know what kind rules you can break, and that's why you will be arrested. But same we collect evidence and testimony. A lot of people exactly through basement and other illegal place of detention at the Donbass from 2014 comes more than 5,000 people, and we documented war crimes like torture, like illegally detaining, sexual or gender-based violence, or destroying objects like hospitals, universities, schools, kindergartens, more than 20,000. It's even before 2022, before full-scale invasion. So all of this we have opportunity to document because 5,000 people, a little bit more, escape was given by money to take them back from there or exchange. That's kind of strategy from Ukrainian sides, exchange with so-called Lugansk and Donetsk People Republic with participation of Russia Federation, who absolutely control these so-called countries, so-called states, by their forces and special services. One of such example, what happened with people and what kind that was prisoning of war or illegally detention, that example of Izolatia. It's such place which before was a big industrial factory, but during the independence of Ukraine started to be a center of modern art, but occupation of 2014 make it factory of fear, pain, and exactly torturing. We have few people who stayed there more than 2 years. They was released and they describe it even at the book to understanding how it's possible. In the middle of so-called Lugansk or Donetsk People Republic exists a place which absolutely controlled by Russian special forces and even so-called authority of Lugansk and Donetsk People Republic, they need just a permission to go there. But through this factory, day by day, going huge numbers of people. Part of them was servers and representative of Ukraine army, but mostly that was just civilians, sometimes who give understood that they absolutely support Ukraine and don't like these so-called new countries, but most of them, they was not even active. Part of them was journalists who working, who trying to cover all the situation there, but most of them, that was a doctor of animals, doctor, veterinaries, tax drivers, IT specialists, people who had some business and owner some business. And all of these people, they exactly don't have or don't do something even to reject this occupation authority. So what we see pattern which before 2022 covered only 7% of territory of Ukraine, that Crimea, where people holding at the pretrial jails, journalists, local politicians, people who before running the NGOs there, or for example, Crimea Tatars. Sometimes it's Crimea Tatars representatives like members of Kurultai or members of Medjelis. It's Crimea Tatars native representation democracy system. But sometimes it's just
민주적인
the
시스템이
people who
있다고
live in
했지만
Crimea Tatars
제대로 운영이
villages
되지
or
않았습니다.
small towns. And
여기는 굉장히
their
작은 마을들이
guilty
있었죠.
was only in that their community which not
그 지역
accepted
사회가
occupation by Russian forces.
러시아
But what happened
점령을 거부한
2022?
이유로
If at 2021 we
어려움을
have a
겪어야 된
list,
것입니다.
we
그런데
have 400 of such
2022년에
people politically motivated, arrested, and kept at
정치적으로
Russian
이제
jails.
동기가 부여된 사람
Transfer people from Donetsk or from Donbass, occupied part of Donbass, or from Crimea. They transfer them to the Russian territory, most longest distant from their relatives, so nobody exactly have opportunity to support them or coming visit them or give them some support through financial system of Russian jails. And that was horrible, and that was 400 people. But 2022, when Russian occupation coming through huge part of Ukraine, at the beginning of 2022, they trying to keep more than 30% of territory of Ukraine and even trying to control Kiev. But now we have a 22% of our territory controlled by Russian forces, and each this place started to be a huge jail when Russians not only like create special jails in the occupied territory, but mostly they send out to the Russian territory people, war prisoners. That's more logical because that's war, so war prisoners, it's legal if you care about this status and give them full numerous of full points of Geneva Convention guarantee, like, for example, normal condition, support by medicine, connection with the relatives, or for first point, it's opportunity to have access to International Red Cross Committee, but nothing of that. Russia not guarantee war prisoners. And when we speak about civilian prisoners, de facto, that's absolutely kidnapping people who stay at Russian jails incommunicado. That means that Russia not give any charges of these people, any accusation, why they exactly stay there. And when we're trying to cooperate with Russia lawyers and ask them to, in legal way, how it's possible in Russia, exactly figure out why these people holding in the jail or illegal place of detention, we don't have any answers. Just at the beginning, just 5 such answers, absolutely similar, was about that these people reject of occupation and special military operation with Russia holding. So what we have like more than 10,000 absolutely civilian people who anyway connecting with Ukrainian army. These people staying at illegal place of detention. We're trying to figure out then that huge problem that Russia not recognize them at all, and even in their own legal system, they don't use it. They not give them any accusation or charging. So we try and exactly work with this category. And here I will stop, and we will be really, really glad to some of your questions at the Q&A session. Anna, please.
Great, thank you, Sasha. That was excellent. We're going to move on now to our international law experts. First, we will have Ilya, who is the interim head of the International Justice Desk for the International Federation for Human Rights, FIDH. Ilya has authored several publications and academic papers in international humanitarian law, human rights, and transitional justice. Some of his latest works are Post-Conflict Justice, Extending International Criminal Responsibility to Non-State Entities, and the Dynamics of Collective Memory in the Ukraine Crisis, a Transitional Justice Perspective. Ilya, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, Hannah, and the organizer for giving me the floor. It's an honor for me to be part of this panel. And I've been asked to touch on the legal aspects of state and individual responsibility of North Korea and its officials for first supplying munitions and then deploying conscripted soldiers. Now that we have the factual overview, I will go into some of these legal aspects. So first off, does North Korea incur any responsibility under international law for supplying the millions of artillery shells, as Natalia has described it to Russia? And if so, what is the nature of the violations? So the short answer is yes. North Korea is responsible under international law. And that's because Russia is committing aggression against Ukraine. I think it's not controversial. And as such, Russia is committing an internationally wrongful act. Not only that, but it is also committing a violation of a peremptory norm of international law in committing aggression within the meaning of the so-called draft articles on state responsibility, which reflect customary international law. And under this body of rules, states cannot aid or assist in the commission of internationally wrongful acts, nor should any state aid or assist in maintaining the situation caused by a breach of a peremptory norm of international law. Therefore, to the extent that North Korea is aiding and sustaining Russia's
하는 행위로 규정이 되어 있습니다. 그래서 군수물자에 대한 공급, 그런 침략 행위에 사용되는 그런 군수물자의 공급은 제 결론은 국제법에 위반되는 것이라고 생각합니다. 그리고 이로 인해 북한이 국가 차원의 책임을
abetting aggression and other international crimes. As Natalia has mentioned, these shells, if it is known to North Korean officials that these shells are being used to commit violations of international humanitarian law, then there is complicity in war crimes, among other violations. So, I would, however, go short of qualifying North Korea at that point, merely for supplying artillery shells as being a co-aggressor state, because supplying arms alone does not amount to a use of force under the UN Charter, nor would supplying such weapons make North Korea a state party to the armed conflict within the meaning of international humanitarian law, because it has not at that point been involved directly in hostilities, using, among others, the definition of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And now, how does the situation change after having supplied personnel? Well, now we enter what's called the jus ad bellum, or the reasons for going to war territory, because North Korean soldiers, as agents of a North Korean state, are directly participating in hostilities in the war in Ukraine. And there's no, I think, controversy in that respect any longer. I think we have a factual confirmation of them being involved directly in hostilities. Because Ukraine is exercising self-defense vis-a-vis Russia, North Korea is not justified in using force against Ukraine. In other words, it is not exercising self-defense. There is no other lawful means for them to exercise force against Ukraine, and hence it is a good argument to be made that North Korea is committing aggression. And please note here, this is important, that it doesn't matter where the use of force is taking place, whether it's on Ukrainian territory or Russian territory. This doesn't matter as long as North Korean soldiers are engaged in the use of force against Ukraine. Even on Russian territory, Ukraine is acting as a co-aggressor with Russia in violation of the UN Charter. There is one one wrinkle, if you will. Under those same articles, on draft articles on state responsibility, Article 6, in rare circumstances, soldiers could be placed by one state at the disposal of another state, which could shift responsibility entirely from the sending to the receiving state. So soldiers of North Korea might be placed entirely at the disposal of Russia to see for Russia to see how it wants to use these soldiers as it sees fit. which could displace North Korean responsibility with Russia's responsibility. This is a very specialized notion, implying that the organ is acting with the consent under the authority,
해당
exclusive authority, and for the
파견을 받는
purposes
국가의
of the
동의
receiving
하에
state.
해당 국가의
And
권한
so
아래에서
the
해당
factual
국가의
inquiry we must
목적을
be
위해
making is
행동한다는
whether
것을
this is the
의미합니다.
case. So in other
이러한
words, does North Korea
경우인지에 대한
relinquish
사실 확인이
responsibility
필요하고요.
entirely by making
북한이
these soldiers available,
전적으로
or does it maintain some
그
authority?
러시아의 책임하에 둔 건지 아니면
Marko
일부
Milanovic,
책임은
a
그대로
professor
본인들이
that has written on
가져가는지
this issue,
중요한
believes
부분입니다.
that a dual
마르코
responsibility
밀라노비치
is
같은 경우에는
possible,
이중
whereas
책임에 대한
here
부분도
North Korea
가능하다고 주장을
is
하고 있습니다. 이런
continuing to
경우는
exercise some authority, and I tend to agree because by virtue of the size of the North Korean force, between 8 and 12 soldiers, the number of officers that have been sent, 500 officers, the language barrier, and so on, it seems very unlikely that those officers are left entirely to the disposal of the Russian authorities, integrated entirely into the Russian command, relinquishing all responsibility. I do believe that, and this will be interesting to hear from other panelists, there's some level of control and communication and direction still coming from the North Korean authorities to these officers that are dispatched to Ukraine or to the Russian territory to fight Ukrainians. Just to conclude, I know that the next speaker will speak to the use in bello perspectives, in other words, the consequences under international humanitarian law, the law of war, of North Korea's involvement, especially when it comes to the treatment of North Korean soldiers in captivity. But I will just speak to the question of targeting at this point. So because North Korea sent its soldiers, it is now engaged in a separate international armed conflict against Ukraine, or the same international armed conflict as Russia against Ukraine. That doesn't really matter for the purposes of targeting, because all three states have ratified the additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, and so the law of targeting of international armed conflict applies. And that means that should the North Korean soldiers meet the definition of combatants, and I believe they do, they could be targeted anywhere, even at their bases in or around Kursk or any other region in Russia, and even in North Korea. So the only question mark I guess I would have with respect to definition of combatants is whether and to what extent North Korean soldiers are able to enforce compliance with the rules of international humanitarian law. I have no idea how well trained these soldiers are, but I think that could be a further question to explore. I have doubts as to whether North Korean soldiers are sufficiently trained in IHL to respect the rules, and hence that would entail another possible violation of international humanitarian law and international law by extension more broadly. I will stop here and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilya. I think we started with lots of questions and are continuing with more questions as we go on, but hopefully things will get a little bit clearer. Last but not least, for our final speaker for the first session, we have Valerie, who is the co-director for Uprights. Valerie has over a decade of experience as a legal advisor for the UN in the areas of international criminal law, international humanitarian law, human rights law, and transitional justice. Prior to forming Uprights, Valerie worked for the UN in Mali and the DRC, where she investigated international crimes and gross human rights violations and provided recommendations to improve accountability for crimes committed during the Kasai and Malian conflicts. She's also worked with the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and also related to Cambodia as well. While we have Valerie as our final speaker for the first session, I am going to open it slowly up for questions for the first session panelists. So if you'd like to submit your questions using the Q&A functions, we will also have an opportunity for questions after the second session as well. But without further ado, Valerie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for organizing this this event today. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to talk about this very interesting legal issue. And I'm going to try to keep it short so we can have a chance to discuss. Even if we still don't know all the details about North Korean soldier statutes and involvement in the armed conflict, their deployment on the ground and their engagement in the hostility raise a lot of their, as I say, very maybe selfishly interesting legal questions for international humanitarian law and human rights practitioners. In these short presentations, and a lot have already been said about the facts, the context, and to some degree the legal aspect, I would like to provide some answer to only one aspect of it, is what does humanitarian law provide for if and when North Korean soldiers would be captured or surrendered to Ukrainian troops. What I'm hoping here is kind of bridging the bridge between the first part of the presentation and the second part of the presentation today, which will touch more upon the condition of North Korean soldiers. So in our opinion, and I fully agree with the presentation that was just given before by Elia in terms of the international law question that arise in relation to the deployment of North Korean troops in the international armed conflict. In our opinion, it is likely that the deployment of troops and by engaging in the hostility, North Korea has now become a party to the ongoing international armed conflict. But regardless of the final answer to these questions, in our opinion, one thing is clear: North Korean soldiers would qualify as combatant and would be entitled to prisoner of war status if they fall into the power of Ukraine, which would trigger the application of the Third Geneva Convention of 1949 on the treatment of prisoner of war. So what are the rights and obligations of Ukraine in relation to this North Korean prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention for the case if and when they are captured or surrender? The short answer is Ukraine has the same rights and obligations as for Russian soldiers that fall into the power of Ukraine. But let me elaborate here on a few points that I believe are likely going to be relevant in the context of North Korean prisoner of war. First, obviously, Ukraine has the obligation under the Geneva Conventions to treat the North Korean soldier who surrender or captured humanly, and that's at all times. The Third Geneva Conventions provide for the minimum standard of treatment of prisoner of war, including an absolute prohibition of reprisal and to subject them to ill treatment or torture. I'm not gonna go further on that. What I would like to emphasize more in this presentation is the right of Ukraine in this case. Ukraine has the authority to intern prisoner of war during the duration of the active hostilities. This is the whole idea behind the Third Geneva Convention, is to prevent North Korean soldiers
할 수가
from
있습니다.
participating
그러니까
against
북한군이 다시 전쟁에 참가하지 못하도록 구금할 수 있다는 이야기입니다. 이것은 우크라이나가 갖고 있는 권한입니다.
In other words, as long as there is
그러니까
active
적대가
hostility,
지속되는 경우, 전쟁이 지속되는 동안에는 우크라이나는 북한 포로를 구금할 수
That being said, even as active hostilities continue, Ukraine could, if they would want to, and at their own discretions, could decide to transfer prisoner of war to a neutral state that is a party to the Geneva Convention, such as South Korea, for instance, if Ukraine is satisfied that there is a willingness and the ability from the receiving state to apply the Geneva Convention. Geneva Convention 3 also indicates that Ukraine may conclude agreements with a view to the direct repatriation or internment in a neutral country of prisoner of war, in particular if they have undergone a long period of captivity. Given South Korean human rights record and its sympathy for North Korean defectors, this could be an option that Ukraine could consider if encouraged to do so, for instance, by South Korean authorities. North Korean soldier prisoner of war may also be repatriated while the hostilities are still ongoing in the context of a potential exchange of prisoners between the parties of the conflict. While exchange of prisoner is not actively promoted by the ICRC, they are not prohibited under international humanitarian law. And as we've heard earlier, they have been taken place between Ukraine and Russia on several occasions, including recently. This exchange of prisoner would aim at sending back some prisoner of war to their country of nationality or to the states in whose armed force they serve against the return of prisoner of war from the other side. Moreover, after the cessation of active hostilities, North Korean soldiers must be released and repatriated without delay. The obligation to repatriate prisoners of war requires sending them back to the state in whose armed force they serve, not their state of nationality. Typically, this will be the state of nationality. However, in cases where this individual fought on behalf or otherwise belonged to the military of another state, that's to these states that they will be sent back. Based on the above and based on what we know so far on the ground, generally, North Korean prisoner of war should be repatriated to North Korea, unless it would be considered that North Korean soldiers have fought on behalf or otherwise could be considered to belong to the Russian armed force. But I think at this point, the presumption is that they would be repatriated to Korea. In these two situations, whether we're talking about exchange of prisoners or repatriation at the end of the hostilities, can North Korean prisoner of war refuse to be sent back to North Korea or eventually Russia? And what are Ukraine's obligations in this respect? This will be the last question I'm going to answer to. Article 109.3 of Geneva Convention 3 explicitly prohibits the repatriation of seriously wounded or sick prisoners of war against their will. So this is the only provision under the Geneva Conventions that provides for a prohibition to return prisoners of war against their will and without needing to justify a reason for that wish. Outside of this exception, the ICRC generally holds that prisoner of war mere desire not to be repatriated in itself is not a valid barrier for repatriations. However, the ICRC views is also that parties to the conflict should respect the wishes of POWs. That being said, this doesn't mean that North Korean prisoners of war can be repatriated without conditions. According to the well-established human rights principle of non-refoulement, states may not transfer a person within their control to another state if they have substantial grounds of believing that the person is in danger of serious human rights violations in that state. Non-refoulements also apply to prisoners of war in our opinions and prohibits forced repatriations if
이제 강제 송환을 금지하고 있는데요. 그래서 북한군의 전쟁 포로를 강제로 송환해서는 안 된다는 얘기입니다.
For instance, in the context of the Korea War,
예를 들어서 한국 전쟁에 의해서 유엔사에서는
resolution recognizing that the non-refoulement principle
결의를 통해서
applied to prisoners of war. It could be even argued that the non-refoulement principle is a peremptory norm under international law, and that therefore it would trump the application of Article 118 of Geneva Convention in case of disagreement in the application of those two norms. At this stage, it is too early to say whether North Korean prisoner of war, if the situation even occurred, would oppose repatriations because of fear of persecution upon return, and we do not know how North Korean prisoner of war would be treated upon return. That being said, given North Korean poor record of compliance with its humanitarian and human rights obligations, this is certainly a question that is likely to arise and cannot be ignored. Just as a matter of example, there have been a number of examples in the past, just to cite one of two. During the Korean War, North Korean and Chinese prisoners of war refused to be repatriated to their home country because the fear of being executed and of imprisonment. And in order to prevent forced repatriation, the UN had established a screening process to determine the wish of the prisoner of war. The same type of process happened in the context of the Soviet-Afghan War and also in the context of the Second Gulf War, where a number of Iraqi prisoners of war were not willing to return, and around 15,000 of them were then relocated to another country. To conclude, I would just like to say that the involvement of neutral states or organizations such as the ICRC could be crucial in mediating and facilitating negotiations over the repatriation or exchange of future North Korean prisoners of war. Neutral parties can help ensure that the prisoner's rights are protected and that decisions are made in compliance with Geneva III. For example, if repatriation to North Korea is deemed safe, third states such as South Korea and others may be asked to accommodate prisoners of war temporarily or permanently via political arrangement. That being said, this is also challenging politically and logistically for Ukraine, and it could create political pressure on the country vis-à-vis the situation of its own soldiers that are currently prisoners of war in Russia. And this is particularly important, especially given the appalling situation that Ukrainian prisoners of war are now experiencing in Russia, as it was very well described earlier in this presentation. So I will leave it there. I think here my intention was just to give a little bit of potential implication of the IHL prisoner of war legal framework for discussions in this part, but also in the second part, I believe. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Valerie. That was an excellent bridge to our next session. Before we open up for session 2, we do have 2 questions from the floor. The first question is for Ilya, but I think also, Valerie, you might also be able to speak a little bit on this as well. If you have any thoughts, please feel free to jump in. But the question is, in terms of individual criminal responsibility, even if there is information to support the case that North Korean officers and soldiers are liable for the crime of aggression, the ICC subject matter jurisdiction over the crime of aggression is very restricted. Can the Ukrainian or other domestic courts exercise jurisdiction over such a case? I'll also read out the second question while Ilya and maybe our international law experts, Valerie, to also take a think about it. And the other question is for Natalia, and I think maybe Alexandra could also speak on this as well. But the question is, Ukraine's I Want to Live project has been credited with facilitating the surrender of 350 Russian soldiers. Did these surrenders happen mostly before the onset of the current trench warfare dominated by the artillery drill since late 2022? Are there any lessons that may be applied for inducing North Korean soldiers to surrender? Ilya, Valerie, if you want to go, maybe Ilya, do you want to answer your question first?
Sure. Thank you for the question. You're absolutely right that there is no jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court over the crime of aggression with respect to this situation as of now. But there are avenues of international criminal responsibility for this crime elsewhere. I'll start with national courts. Ukraine itself has criminalized the crime of aggression, and as far as I know, has already tried several individuals for this crime. So Ukraine is able to do so, and other national jurisdictions where the exercise of universal jurisdiction over the crime of aggression is possible. So those are however remote possibilities. And then, as you might know, to fill this gap of aggression the international community, jointly with Ukraine, is now considering the establishment of a special tribunal on the crime of aggression. After various modalities have been considered, the lead appears now to be with the model of a hybrid court established through an agreement between the Council of Europe and Ukraine. This has been the latest development as far as I know, and that court would have jurisdiction solely over the crime of aggression, and arguably any state such as Belarus or North Korea that has facilitated Russia's aggression or itself been a co-aggressor can be, or any state official, I should say, that has facilitated Russia's aggression can then be stand before that court, should in fact it be established at some point in the near or distant future. And the last possibility, I would say, is the subsequent amendment of the Rome Statute to facilitate the use of the crime of aggression, because now there are some caveats that make it very difficult to use. But anyway, let's not enter that territory. So I would say for now, it could be possible under national jurisdictions, and in the future, possibly with this new court on the crime of aggression. Perhaps other panelists have some other ideas.
Valerie, would you like to add anything? We also have a similar question, which Ilya mostly answered, around the jurisdiction question on which court has jurisdiction over war crimes committed by Russia and North Korea. Is the ICC or Ukrainian court being considered? I also recall there are discussions about the creation of an ad hoc special tribunal for war crimes. What's the situation regarding this? I think Ilya mostly responded to this question, but Valerie, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think he answered very well. The only point, maybe just to be clear, under the ICC statute, the crimes of aggression is a leadership crime. So we're not necessarily talking about the responsibility of those North Korean soldiers that are deployed on the ground, if we're talking at least at the definition at the international level. Now, Ukrainian law has a much broader definition of the crime of aggressions, and there have been a lot of legal discussion in Ukraine about this leadership clause, so which level can be targeted by the crime of aggressions. And maybe someone can correct me if I'm saying something wrong, because I'm not an entire specialist, but I know there is a Supreme Court decision that have limited it to the higher level. But maybe you want to say something.
Okay, Valerie, I'll jump in. I think that the court about the crime of aggression, it's about the Russian leadership. There are particular people, the Security Council of Russia, and it's for the crime of the aggression. So it's out, like it has little to do with the North Korean soldiers fighting. But there are a couple of things I want to stress, and I know that Alexandra also want to join, because I understand this theoretical legal discussion, but I want to return us to the realities of this particular war, because most of the questions to us always is about the potential defection of the Korean soldiers.
그런 질문들이 그 북한 군인들의 그런 탈북에 대한 부분이 장기적으로 일어나거나 한다면, 그리고 지금 포로 교환의 상황에 대해서 저희가 이해하는 그런 바들에 따라서 저희가 생각을 해보면, 지금 우크라이나의 전쟁 포로가 지금 러시아에 8,000명가량 있는 것으로 나타나고 있습니다.
The Russian soldiers, including soldiers of, I don't know, various ethnicities, they can be Kazakh, others in the Ukrainian prisons. Ukraine is, we cannot verify, obviously, but because there is excess of the international bodies, they are kept in different places in Ukraine, and to larger extent, the rights of the prisoners of war kept by the Ukrainian army, it's kind of, let's say, kept to extent it's possible. At the same time, Ukrainian General Prosecutor Office, opened the cases when 90 of the Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russia has been executed. And a huge amount, over 90% who are returning to Ukraine, are told about being tortured, the Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russia, like a huge amount in a very violent way. So the huge call of the Ukrainian authorities, and everybody is to return Ukrainian prisoners of war because chances they are not survive or they are tortured are very high, and the conditions are horrible. But the figure is disproportional. For many, many, many years, since 2014, Ukraine demands exchange all for all. It never happens, and it probably won't happen. It's always a special operation with returning this 100, that 100. So I should say that it's a complicated process, and potentially, if the North Korean soldiers would say they do not want to be returned to Russia, they will stay. So, there is no need to pressure. The problem is different. Absolute majority of the soldiers would be rather killed before they even raise the issue. And I think that's very important, that I do understand the need of the Korean colleagues to think what we do with these potentially soldiers, which may be potentially some of them, taken as prisoners of war. But we would understand there would be a few individuals, like there would be maybe a few of them, dozens, numbers, but not even probably hundreds. And most of them would be killed way before, they can they would be approached to the Ukrainian positions. So I think it's very important not to limit the discussion, if we're really speaking about preserving the lives, not to limit the discussion speaking about potentially 10 soldiers out of the thousands, which will become the prisoners of war and which potentially, most probably, will have a choice to stay. It would be largely symbolic. It's still people, even if it's 5, 6, 7, but we would stress that at this stage, what we can also discuss, how we avoid the situation that they send to the battlefield, as and that would be something which would have the real impact on their lives. It doesn't mean we don't need to care, but I'm speaking about thousands of killed and a few people who might become potentially prisoners of war due to the nature how this armed conflict, how this war is fought.
Natalia, do you also want to quickly speak about the I Want to Live project before we hand it over to Alexandra to answer those two questions as well?
So yes, there is an opportunity to defect before. There is an opportunity, but I'm afraid that in this particular case, it's a bit more complicated for the people, not speaking language, not having the access, and there are some of the initiative of Ukraine to issue the papers and calls in Korean, and as well, the guarantee is there. What we also know that a lot of Russian soldiers who have access to the Russian language publication, who know about the story, still don't believe that they will be treated fairly. And that's a part of the Russian indoctrination and propaganda inside their army, that they would be killed and executed, disregarding, how successful Ukrainian campaign is. So yes, the Russian soldiers are defecting. Some of them are, following and responding to the campaign. But those who are kept usually say that they were told that they would, they won't survive, because that's how they explained. So we also working in the environment where they are explained that they better not do so by the, Russian counterparts, by their officers, deliberately told that way.
Thanks, Natalia. Alexandra, do you want to finish the session off with some comments?
Yeah, I'm just to add few my comments, few my reflexi. First, I want to support Natalia. That's really important to understand that Ukrainian army 3 times less than Russians by numbers, and all other citizens of other countries, which exactly now we see official representation from North Korea, but it exists non-official.
북한군이 이제 러시아 군에 이제 참여하고 있습니다.
All of these people, they really big dangers for Ukrainian soldiers, and it's difficult.
러시아 군과 또 북한군과 또 러시아 군을 돕는 사람들은 우크라이나 군 입장에서 굉장히 위협입니다.
Like I want to I want to stay alive and such. That why they was created, because it's not only dangerous, from example, from missiles from Ukraine side or something like this. Sometimes we have such situation when Russia soldiers like wounded their own colleagues because these colleagues decided go into captivity. So we need to understand that it's not white and black situation at the front line, and dangerous around the different surround you from different points. Really important, I think, all other about captivity is absolutely supported. Natalia covered it. But when we speak about, you asked about court procedure and opportunity to have some form of justice. We have 5 different kinds of courts, which included all of this conflict situation. First of all, it's International Criminal Court, which exactly started working at Ukraine after Maidan 2013. So it's a long story with our relationship. And finally, we have full ratification of Rome Institute and now really active work for whole other legislation, which exactly need to implement whole the international norms inside the national court. So International Criminal Court and national courts will work. Ukrainian national courts will work together, but it's levels, different levels. Big fish, the International Criminal Court. If we will speak about that, we have, for example, North Korean soldiers. They first of all will be at the national Ukrainian court. Second court, which exactly involved on all of this situation, it's International Court Justice of UN. We know it's not about personal deals; it's about different convention. And here, for example, South Korea can be our partners to appeal some suits or some cases against the Russia for something illegal or something broken the IHL connecting with the North Korean soldiers, for example, because I don't think the Russians, Russian army don't care about their own soldiers. I can't just hope that North Korean soldiers, will be much more treated at the Russia army. So it's one of the way what kind court procedure can be involved. Third one, it's really important. European Court of Human Rights. We still appeal there about Russia. Here, I don't see any opportunities, to be connected with North Korean soldiers. And last one, it's universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction, it's opportunity. Any country in the world exactly
관할권을 통해서 할 수 있다. 보편 관할권이라는 것은 어느 곳에서든 접근을 할 수 있습니다. 그래서 우크라이나가 이제 요구를 하는 것은 만약에 이 보편 관할권이라는 그 모델이 매력적이라고 보인다면
directions and vectors which we can use. For example, any decision at the South Korean court, which can be connection around the environment of participation of North Korea's soldiers. I think it's creative way, I understood, but I think it's one of the way how it can be prepared, for example, for some negotiation to take North Korean soldiers and bring them to Seoul, not to autocracy territory of North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra, Natalia, Valerie, and Ilya. I think that was an excellent opening to our webinar. As Alexandra mentioned, it's not black and white, and this webinar is not here to answer all the questions. We're here to put the questions out on the table to see what the different information that is available is, and look for these gaps and ways to fill it, and especially look for paths for solidarity between these different human rights communities. I know there have been more questions about jurisdiction, especially at you, Ilya, but I think a lot of it has been covered by our other panelists, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for our second session. But thank you again to our first session panelists, and hopefully we can jump back in for a great discussion overall. Now, in part 2, the discussion will turn to the overlooked realities of the North Korean soldiers who are being forced into the conflict. As I mentioned, part 2 will mostly be conducted in Korean, so please make sure that your interpretation channel is on English. I think it's important for us to have a better understanding of who these North Korean soldiers are that have been forcibly conscripted, and what could they possibly be thinking in this situation. Our first speaker is Uh, Sangyeon Ryu. Sangyeon was born in North Korea in the 1990s. I think he is our youngest panelist today. And he was conscripted to the DPRK military when he was a teenager. He remained as a soldier until 2019, so very recently, until he crossed over the DMZ to South Korea. Recently, he was in the Wall Street Journal and other major newspapers speaking about his experience as a North Korean soldier and what he possibly could think of his comrades going through today. So, Songyeon, the floor is yours. I'm going to hand it over to you.
잘 들리시나요?
네, 잘 들립니다.
네. 일단은 앞서서 저기 소개받은 것처럼 저는 북한에 17살에 군대 가서 군복무 하다가 2019년에 군복무 만 7년쯤 했을 때, 이게 한국으로 DMZ 넘어서 귀순을 했습니다. 무엇보다 여기 참여하신 분들이 중요하게 북한군이 어떤 마인드를 가지고 전쟁에 참가하고 그리고 어떤 과정을 거쳐서 가느냐 하는 게 좀 중요할 것처럼 생각됩니다. 첫 번째 이제 우크라이나 이제 앞서서 발표하신 분이 전쟁에 대해서 정의롭게 어떻게 해야 된다는 그런 말씀을 하셨습니다. 네. 군인에게 정의는 이기는 게 정의입니다. 네. 이게 그냥 보통 북한 군인들이 이런 마인드를 가지고 있구나 하고 받아들여 주시면 좋겠습니다. 네. 제가 북한군에서 7년 동안 복무했지만 전쟁은 어떤 규칙을 가지고 해야 된다는 교육을 받은 적이 없습니다. 그리고 전쟁에서 자기가 생명이 위협당할 때 포로로 그 선택을 해서 포로가 될 수 있다. 이런 교육은 받아본 적이 없습니다. 북한의 정신교육의 어떤 노래의 가사가 있는데, 그것에서 총탄 마지막 한 발은 자기의 생명을 끊는 거로 되어 있습니다. 어떤 일이 있어도 적에게 절대로 포로된다는 건 없습니다. 네. 제가 한국에 와서 전쟁에 어떤 규칙이 있고, 뭔가 그 규칙을 벗어나면 전쟁 범죄로 된다는 걸 한국에 와서 알았습니다. 네, 제가 나름 북한에서는 군대장까지도 했던 그런 사람임에도 불구하고 모든 방법을 써서 전쟁에서는 이기면 그만입니다. 네. 그리고 또 어떤 사람들이 이제 어떤 방법으로 차출돼서 우크라이나 전쟁에 전선에 파견됐냐 하는 거에 대해서 말씀을 드린다면, 북한군에서 나름 제 신장이 군인으로서 쓸 수 있는 사람들이 폭풍군단이라는 사람들입니다. 네, 그 사람들이 전쟁에 지금 선발돼 간 거로 국제 뉴스랑 이렇게 나오고 있는데, 그거는 그냥 노동당에서 가라면 가는 겁니다. 자기 의사와는 전혀 상관이 없습니다. 또는 그냥 야 여기 전쟁 가고 싶은 사람 손 들어봐.
The Labor Party wants you to go, then you go. It's nothing to do with willingness. So for people who the overall situation of the life that they're put in, it's like a war zone. So
할 수 있다면 자기의 운명을 바꿀 수 있는 계기가 되고, 또 다른 나라를 경험할 수 있는 그런 절대적인 기회라고 생각할 수 있기 때문에, 만약에 제가 한국에 안 왔다고 하면 저도 전쟁에 그냥 가겠다고 손을 들었을 거예요. 네. 여기 많은 나라들에서는, 민주주의 국가들에서는 군인으로서 참가 안 하고, 또 군인으로서가 아니라 또는 정치인으로서가 아니라 여러 가지 그런 직업이 너무 많잖아요. 그런데 북한은 김정은 정권에게 충실할 때만이 어떤 상대적으로 괜찮은 생활을 할 수가 있습니다. 그러기 위해서는 노동당의 눈에 들어야 되는 겁니다. 그래서 그런 전쟁을 불사하고라도 그냥 손을 들고 가겠다고 하는 거죠. 그런데 이제는 제가 한국에 와서 좀 나름대로 관심을 가지고 좀 배운 지식의 근거에서 말씀을 드린다면, 우크라이나 전선에 지금 가서 싸우는 그 군인들이 아무것도 모릅니다. 그냥 가서 싸워 하면 그냥 싸우는 겁니다. 자아가 전혀 없는 거죠. 가령 어떤 전쟁에 용병이 참가한다면 그 용병들은 돈을 위해서 싸운다고 볼 수가 있습니다. 그래서 그들이 저지른 전쟁 범죄에 대해서는 그 받을 그런 조건을 가지고 참가했기 때문에 그래서 처벌이 어떻게 좀 가능할지도 모르겠습니다. 그런데 북한 군인들은 자기의 의사가 전혀 없고요. 그리고 자기 이 생각이 다 노동당 북한 김정은 체제로부터 주입받은 생각들입니다. 그래서 전혀 이걸 어떻게 어떤 기준으로 그들을 처벌해야 될지도 상당히 좀 모호한 그런 상황인 것 같아요. 그래서 이제 여기 우크라이나 시민단체에서도 참가하신 것 같은데 만약에 북한군이 포로로 뭐 우크라이나에 잡히거나 그러면 기본적인 전쟁 규칙 같은 거 이런 거를 그 군인들에게 알려줄 필요가 있을 것 같습니다. 네, 그래서 그들이 지금 행하고 있는 게 옳은지 아니면 옳지 않은지 이것 자체를 분간할 수 있는 그런 능력을, 시야를 키워줘야 되는 거죠. 북한 군인들은 그런 자체를 전혀 모르니까요. 그리고 그 군인들은 북한에 돌아간다고 해도 그들이 결코 돈을 아마 저는 못 받을 거라고 생각을 하거든요. 그들이 10분의 1에 해당하는 그런 돈도 못 받을 거라고 생각을 해요. 그래서 이거는 정말 그냥 우리가 똑같은 인간임은 분명한데 그들이 인권을 가져야 함도 그런 것도 분명하고 한데 그들을 처벌함에 있어서 우리가 그 법을 집행하는 데 있어서 이 사람이 의도적으로 했냐 또 아니면 모르고 했냐에 따라서도 형량이 좀 달라지는 걸로 제가 알고 있습니다. 북한 군인들도 그에 해당한 모르고 한 그에 대해서 조금 국제사회가 그에 대해서 좀 네, 인지할 필요가 있지 않을까 이렇게 예, 생각을 해봅니다. 그리고 뭔가 우크라이나에서 심리전이랑 할 때 그 심리전 같은 걸 하면 뭐 쌀밥에 고기 주겠다 이런 심리전을 하는데 이거는 상당히 잘못된 심리전이라고 생각을 해요. 네. 그 사람들이 거기 갔을 때는 우크라이나가 주는 쌀밥에 고기를 먹으려고 귀순할 일은 전혀 없습니다. 네. 그리고 그런 심리전을 할 것 같으면 전쟁의 규칙에 대해서 알려주는 게 조금 더 나을 것 같아요. 그래서 그들이 진짜 뭐 싸운다고 하더라도 이런 상황은 국제적으로 어떤 전쟁이 어떤 규칙 속에서 벌어지고 이런 것쯤은 적어도 알고 싸우고 그리고 그걸 알고도 그런 짓을 했다면 그에 해당한 어지간한 그런 개선에서 뭐 처벌도 가능하겠죠. 네. 참 제가 한국에 와서야 제 삶이 얼마나 더 중요한가, 내 삶도 또한 중요하구나 한 걸 느낍니다. 여기 지금 제가 하는 이야기가 뭐 북한 군인들에게 전해질지는 모르겠지만 북한 군인들 그 개인 한 사람 한 사람도 정말 인간으로서의 존엄을 가진 사람들입니다. 그런데 오직 김정은 그 일개인의 존엄만을 위해서 그 뭐 노예 같은 삶을 살고 있는 그 사람들을 정말 어 그냥 뭐 그냥 뭐라고 말을 하기가 좀 예, 힘드네요. 네. 좀 국제사회가 북한의 이런 인권 상황에 대해서 좀 간과하지 말고 어떤 인권 회의랑 이 우크라이나 전쟁뿐만 아니라 유엔에서 어떤 인권 회의랑 일어나면 북한 사람들이 대체 어떤 인식을 가지고 인권을 바라보고 있고 노동당은 어떻게 그 인권 유린을 하는지 이 여러 가지 양면을 잘 되짚어 보고 북한에 요구를 해도 좀 그런 북한의 상황을 잘 이해하고 요구를 하면 북한이 좀, 어, 자기들이 막 이렇게 인권을 행할 때 조금, 네, 조금 주저하는 면이 있겠죠. 네, 북한도. 자기들이 계속해서 어떤 진짜 팩트적인 면에서 공격을 받으면 조금, 네, 음, 뭐 변하겠죠. 네, 그럴 희망을 가지고 계속해서 우리가, 네, 인권 활동을 해야 되는 거겠죠. 네. 제가 뭐 할 발언은 여기 이만큼이고요. 뭐 질문이 있으시면 질문을 받고 그렇게 하겠습니다.
네, 감사합니다, 상현쌤. Great. Next, we'll have questions for Songyeon as well at the end. So please keep your questions until the end using the Q&A function. We spoke a lot about jurisdiction and international law in the first session. But I think what's also important to understand is that there are complexities in the way that we in South Korea see this issue as well. And it's important to contrast the reality of international law and South Korean law as well. And for that, we have the perfect expert. We have Professor Chang-Hyun Cho from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Professor Cho is our next speaker, and he specializes in international law at the Law School of Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. His main research areas include international public law, human rights, refugee law, and inter-Korean relations law. He acts as an advisory member for many organizations, such as the Ministry of Unification, Ministry of Justice, and the National Intelligence Service here in South Korea. Professor Cho, the floor is yours.
예, 안녕하십니까. 한국외대 법학전문대학원의 조정현입니다. 오늘 앞에 말씀도 잘 들었고요. 방금 북한군 출신 우리 그 선생님한테 좋은 얘기도 들은 것 같습니다. 저는 국제법적으로 북한군에 대해서 어떻게 보호할지 혹은 또 어떻게 처벌할지 간단하게 몇 말씀 드리고 한국법에서 그럼 이런 북한 군인들을 어떻게 바라보는지 그 두 가지 큰 관점에서 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 일단 앞에 퍼스트 세션에서 그 세 번째, 네 번째에서 국제법과 관련된 얘기들이 많이 나왔는데요. 일반적으로 국가 책임이나 북한의 국가 책임, 스테이트 리스폰시빌리티나 어떤 북한 지도자급이나 군인들의 어떤 형사처벌 관련된 일반적인 얘기에 대해서는 공감하는 바이고요. 일단 북한이 신분이 러시아 부대에 소속이 됐건 아니면은 공식적으로 동맹국 일원으로서 파병을 한 것이건 어쨌든 정식 교전 공동교정국의 지위를 일단 가지는 것으로 미국 국방부에서도 일단 본다고 했고, 신분을 뭐 숨긴다고 숨길 수 있는 일은 아닌 것 같습니다. 그래서 만약에 횡포가 된다면, 포로로서의 대우는, POW로서의 대우는 일단 받을 수 있을 것으로 보이는데요. 아까 이미 말씀드렸듯이, 일단 우크라이나 전쟁 자체가 러시아에 의한 침략 전쟁이기 때문에 거기에 대해서는 유스코겐스 강행규범 위반인 전쟁에 대해서는 레코그니션, 넌 레코그니션, 그러니까 승인하지 않을 국제법상 의무가 있고 또한 그 전쟁이 빨리 종식되기 위해서 협력할 의무가 있는데 북한은 오히려 거기에 대해서 적극적으로 지지를 하고 오히려 전쟁이 지속되도록 러시아를 도와주고 있기 때문에 강행규범 유스콩에스 위반일 뿐더러 공동 어떤 책임국이 충분히 될 수 있는 상황이다 이렇게 말씀드릴 수가 있겠습니다. 최근에 몇 달 전에 러시아와 북한 간의 양자 조약, 동맹조약이 준 동맹조약이 체결이 됐는데요. 거기에 4조에 의하면 유엔 헌장에 기반한 집단적 자위권을 행사할 수 있다 돼 있는데 아시다시피 방금 말씀드렸다시피 우크라이나 전쟁은 먼저 침략을 받은 게 아니고 침략을 러시아가 우크라이나를 향해서 한 거기 때문에 이러한 양자조약 4조가 적용될 가능성은 없다. 그러니까 그 조약을 근거로 얘기할 때 말도 안 되는 소리다 이렇게 얘기하는 게 맞는 반응인 것 같고요. 또 지금 쿠르쿠스 지역인가요? 북한군이 배치된 것이 러시아의 지역이긴 하지만 아까 앞 세션에서 설명해 주셨듯이 그게 원래 우크라이나 땅이었는지 러시아 땅이었는지가 중요한 게 아니고 기본적으로 침략 전쟁에 같이 참전을 한 것이기 때문에 그로 인한 책임은 져야 될 것이다. 다만 ICC 관할권과 관련해서 ICC 주리스딕션과 관련해서 쿠르쿠스 지역에서만 만약에 전쟁 범죄 행위를 했다 그러면 러시아가 ICC 로마 규정의 당사국이 아니기 때문에 북한군은 ICC의 관할권으로부터는 벗어날 수가 있을 것이고, 혹시 돈바스 지역 같은 우크라이나 지역으로 넘어가서 혹시 전쟁 범죄 행위를 한다면, 그때 비로소 ICC의 관할권을 행사할 수 있는 상황이 된다. 그러니까 국가 책임법에서는 차이가 없는데, 국제 형사법에서는 그 어디에서 싸우느냐에 따라서 약간 달라질 수 있다. 그리고 아까 말씀드렸던 침략 범죄라는 것은 러시아와 우크라이나 모두가 ICC의 관할권을 수락해야지만 ICC가 관할권을 행사할 수 있기 때문에 침략 범죄는 기본적으로 어, 우크라이나 전쟁 관련해서는 현재 재판할 수가 없는 것이고, 아까 말씀드렸듯이 국내 법원에서 할 수는 있지만 국내 법원에서 하게 된다면 예를 들면 푸틴이나 김정은 같이 국가 원수에 대해서는 주권 면제 문제가 또 허들이 될 수가 있습니다. 장애물이 될 수가 있습니다. 아무튼 이 얘기는 중요한 얘기는 아니지만 아까 앞에 나왔던 얘기니까 연속해서 좀 말씀을 드리고요. 북한군이 이제 포로로서 잡혔을 때 어떻게 대우해야 될 것이냐. 제네바 제3협약에 따라서 또 제1 추가 의정서에 따라서 잘 대우를 해야 될 것인데 기본적으로 아까 또 자발적으로 돈을 벌기 위해서 또 북한으로부터 인정을 받기 위해서 자발적으로 나도 군대에 갔을 것이다. 뭐 별 생각 없이 이렇게 앞서 또 증언을 해주셨는데 어쨌든 그 상황 자체가 모두가 그랬는지 어쨌는지 확인할 바가 있고 무슨 사유로 우크라이나 전쟁에 갔던지가 참전을 했던지 간에 자유의사에 의해서 나는 북한으로 도저히 북한이나 러시아로 돌아갈 수가 없고 어, 뭐 일단 우크라이나 다른 제3국으로 망명을 한다든지 어사일럼을 시익한다든지 아니면은 우리한테 국적을 줄 수 있는 대한민국으로 가고 싶다 했을 때는 아까 한국 전쟁 때 예도 잘 말씀드렸듯이 그 ICRC에서도 인정한 어떤 예외 하나로서 또 국제 인권법의 발전 상황에 부합하는 내용으로서 그 자유 의사를 기본적으로 존중하는 게 맞겠다 이런 생각을 합니다. 그리고 이것은 꼭 제3국인 우크라이나나 폴란드의 입장에서 한국이 국내 헌법으로 한국
And
입장에서는 북한 주민들은 다 한국의 국민입니다. 근데
so,
실제로 우리들은
from their perspective, that
바로 우리
when they
국민으로서
see
난민으로서
the
대우를
South
안 하고
Korean law,
레퓨지로서 대우를 안 하고
South
바로 우리
Korean
내셔널
law
국민으로서 북한
stipulates that North
주민들을
Korean residents
국적을
are
확인을
South
해주는데요.
Koreans. So they're
예를
not
들면
treated as
영국이나 뭐
refugees, they're
독일이나
treated as
아니면
Korean
호주나
nationals.
캐나다의 경우에 있어서도 최소한 뭐 한국의 헌법적인 입장을 그대로 다 북한을 부정하고 한국의 국적만을 인정하라 이 뜻이 아니고 실제로 영국이나 독일이나 캐나다나 호주 같은 많은 서양 국가들에서도 탈북자들이 노스코리안 SKP들이 난민 지위를 신청을 했을 때 오히려 대한민국으로부터 그러니까 국적을 부여받을 수 있기 때문에 난민 지위를 이중 국적자로서 난민 지위를 인정 안 하는 경우도 있습니다. 그러니까 이와 같은 경우를 고려를 해보면 한국의 국적을 부여를 하는 입장에서 북한 군인이 아까 강제 송환 금지 즉 Principle of Non-Refoulement도 나왔지만 북한으로 돌아가는 것을 거부를 하는 자유의사를 명백하게 표현을 했다면 또 그중에서 대한민국으로 가고 싶다는 의사를 표현했다면 여러 가지 측면에서 국제법적 입장에서 봤을 때는 그 의사를 존중해서 그쪽으로 송환해 주는 것이 일단 기본적으로 맞는 입장이겠다 하는 생각을 말씀을 드립니다. 그리고 거기서 이제 우크라이나 전장에서 북한군을 설득하는 거 아까 말씀드렸듯이 뭐 이밥에 고깃국, 쌀밥에 고깃국 이런 거보다는 오히려 제 개인적인 생각으로는 좀 문화적인 그러니까 예를 들면 K-팝이나 K-컬처나 K-드라마나 한국에서 얼마나 그런 게 자유롭게 되는데 북한에서는 잘 아시다시피 최근에 반동사상 문화 배격법이나 평양 문화보호법, 뭐 또 청년교양부장법 이런 악법들, 문화와 사상을 통제하는 악법들을 많이 법제화, 레지슬레이션 해가지고 탄압을 하고 있는데 그런 문화적인 어떤 자유의 차이 이런 것들을 오히려 강조하는 것이 오히려 또 젊은 군인들한테 더 MZ 세대 군인들한테 더 설득력이 있지 않을까 기본적으로 그런 생각을 해봤습니다. 예, 시간이 더 아마 하면 안 될 것 같아가지고요. 나중에 추가로 질문이 있으면 답변을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
네, 교수님, 감사합니다. 원래 저희가 다음 발제자 윤여상 소장님께 발제할 차례인데요. 저희 유성현 선생님께서 갑작스럽게 나가셔야 돼가지고 질문 들어온 거 하나만 답변을 하고, 네, 저희 세 번째 발제자로 플로어 넘기도록 하겠습니다. 네, 성현 선생님 혹시 지금 답변 가능하실까요?
네, 가능합니다.
네, 질문을 제가 미리 전달 드린 상황이라서 한 번에 바로 답변을 해주시고, 네, 다음 자리로 가시면 돼요.
네, 혹시 다 질문이 어떤 질문인지 알고 계시나요?
네, 질문은 이제 전반적으로 이제 북한 군인들 중에서 우크라이나로 파병됐다는 사실을 알려져 있는지, 또 그 군인들의 가족들이 북한 측에서 구금되어 있다는 뉴스가 있는데, 그게 사실인지에 대한 평가를 듣고 싶다고 질문이
네.
들어왔습니다.
첫 번째로 제 의견을 말씀드린다면, 언론에서 북한에 파병된 그 군인들의 부모들이 때로 어디 따로 격리됐다 이런 뉴스가 있었는데 제가 봤을 때는 이
Soldiers that
뉴스는
have been
신빙성이
dispatched.
없는 뉴스라고
There were reports that they were detained separately, but I don't think this is actually credible news because
네, 그런데 그것을 파병 갔다고 해서 부모들을 그걸 격리시킨다는 것은 이건 시간적으로 북한 스스로에게 자기 눈을 찌르는 거나 같다고 봐요. 그래서 그들을 어떻게 얼려서 달래거나 좀 뭔가 쌀이라도 주면서 이렇게 달래는 방법을 택하지 그걸 물리적으로 구금시키는 일은 저는 없을 거라고 이렇게 생각하는 입장입니다. 그리고 북한에서 군인들이 파병된 것을 내부에 있는 사람들이 알면 어떤 생각을 할까에 대한 질문인데 저는 그에 대해서 어떤 반론을 제기하는 사람이 크게 없을 거라고 봅니다. 왜냐하면 북한에 있는 모든 사람들은 개인이 자기 스스로를 위해서 국가가 자기를 위해서 있는 게 아니라 국가를 위해서 자기가 있다고 생각하는 사람들이 많습니다. 네. 그래서 국가의 부품인 거나 같은 사람, 몸인 거죠. 그래서 국가가 부품을 쓰겠다는데 그게 문제될 게 없죠. 대체로 사고 형식이 그렇게 되어 있습니다. 민주주의 국가에서는 나 다음에 국가인데 이런 집단주의 북한 같은 데서는 국가가 있어야 자기가 있는 겁니다. 그래서 그에 대한 반론은 없을 거라고 저는 봅니다. 네. 이상입니다.
Thank you, Sangyan. I know there are probably lots of questions for you, but for others who are interested in Sangyan's story, he has a YouTube channel, which you can search for, which I will leave as a link for everybody. And thank you, Sangyan, for your time. And I know you have to run off, so we'll see you at another opportunity. With our limited time, we'll quickly move on to our third speaker. Our third speaker is Dr. Yeo Sang-yoon. Dr. Yeo Sang-yoon is the founder of the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, NKDB. He founded our organization in 2003 and was the first person in South Korea to write his PhD on protections for North Korean defectors and escapees. He has held many advisory roles on pathways for protecting North Koreans inside the DPRK, those in transit, and also in the resettlement in South Korea. He's authored multiple reports, including the human rights of North Koreans who are dispatched overseas. And I will hand over the mic to you, Dr. Yoon.
네, 반갑습니다. 앞에서 우크라이나에서 직접 활동하시는 분의 말씀도 들었고요. 러시아 우크라이나 전쟁이 빨리 종식되길 바라지만 북한군의 참전으로 인해서 여러 사정이 복잡하게 된 것 같습니다. 우크라이나 전쟁이 복잡하게 되었다고 하는 것은 트럼프 미국 대통령 당선자의 발표를 통해서도 이미 우리가 확인하고 있는 것인데요. 기존의 이 러시아 우크라이나의 전쟁은 유럽 국가 또 나토와 러시아의 충돌 그런 측면에서 유럽 지역의 안보 문제로 주로 다루어졌습니다만은 이제 북한군의 파병으로 인해서 기존의 유럽 지역의 안보 중심 논의에서 북한 군인의 인권, 한 사람의 인권, 또 군인의 인권, 그리고 이것이 파병의 성격을 갖고 있지만 내용적으로는 용병의 의미를 갖고 있기 때문에 용병이라고 하는 외화를 벌기 위한 노동자라고 하는 성격을 가진 노동자의 노동권까지 영역이 지금 확대되고 있는 것 같습니다. 안보적 문제, 군인의 인권 보호의 문제, 노동자로서의 노동권에 대한 보호까지 확장이 되고 있는 것인데요. 특히 북한군의 파병으로 인해서 이것이 유럽 지역의 안보 문제에서 한반도의 문제, 또 남북한의 문제까지 지금 쟁점이 더욱더 강화되고 있는 그런 상황이 된 것 같고요. 이 기존에 우리 앞에서 많이 논의된 것은 북한군 파병 또 이들이 포로가 되었을 때 보호에 대한 문제, 그리고 개인의 인권의 문제를 중요하게 다루었는데 사실 북한군 파병은 북한의 어떤 안보적인 이익을 얻기 위한 그런 측면만이 아니고 외화 수입을 확대하는 재정적인 이익도 함께 북한 당국이 추구하는 것으로 그렇게 알려져 있습니다. 지금 북한이 핵 개발로 인해서 유엔과 국제사회의 제재를 강하게 지금 받고 있는 상황이고 외화가 부족과 국제적인 고립이 되는 상황인데 북한이 러시아 이 유엔 그 안전보장 이사국인 러시아의 파병을 통해서 북한에 대한 대북 제재의 어느 정도의 약화도 지금 얻어내고 있고 또 이 상당한 이 액수의 외화벌이를 할 수 있는 기회를 갖고 있기
have
때문에
in
북한으로서는
their positioning in the participation of the Russia-Ukraine war, they have cards for negotiation and
추구하고 있는 이러한 상황인 것 같습니다. 사실 북한은 기존에 그 북한 내부에 있던 노동자들을 해외에 수십만 명씩 파견해서 상당한 액수의 외화를 벌여왔습니다. 그리고 그 중에는 북한이 파견한 해외 노동자 중에는 상당수는 현역 군인이었습니다. 그러니까 북한에서 파견한 노동자들이 일반 노동자라고 생각하시는 분들이 있지만 일반 노동자 외에 현역 군인을 해외 노동자의 신분으로 신분만 탈바꿈을 시켜서 해외에 파견했던 겁니다. 남강건설이라고 하는 이름을 가진 북한에서 해외에 나가 있는 건설 회사가 있는데요. 이 남강건설은 모두 북한의 현역 군인입니다. 현역 군인을 군대 편제로 군인 신분으로 사실은 그대로 외화벌이로 보냈던 거죠. 그러니까 북한 당국과 북한 인권 관련 단체 입장에서는 북한의 러시아의 기존 그 군인을 파견한 것은 기존에는 현역 군인을 건설 노동자로 파견했던 것을 이번에는 전투 요원으로까지 확대한 것이다. 그런 것이죠. 사실 파병이 대단한 그런 의미를 갖는 측면도 있지만 저희들이 볼 때는 기존의 북한의 몇십만 명의 현역 군인을 노동자의 의미로서 해외에 파견했던 것을 이번에는 전투 요원까지 파견한 것이기 때문에 본질적으로 성격과 의미의 차이는 있지만 둘 다 외화벌이 목적을 갖는 것은 큰 차이가 없다는 것입니다. 그러니까 노동자의 역할이나 군인 역할이나 모두 개인의 생명에 대한 개인의 인권에 대한 보호가 필요한 것이고 노동권 차원에서도 보호가 동일하게 필요하다는 것입니다. 그러니까 군인의 입장으로만 봐서 안보와 군인의 인권, 포로에 대한 문제로만 우리가 러시아의 북한군 파병을 바라봐서는 안 된다는 것이죠. 그러한 측면이 물론 강조될 수밖에 없고 그러한 것이 중심이 되는 것이지만 북한이 기존에도 현역 군인들을 남강건설과 같은 형태로 외화벌이로 해외에 보내왔었고 이번에는 노동자가 아닌 군인의 신분으로 파견한 그러한 점도 변화를 가져온 것이기 때문에 현역 군인의 신분 외에 용병 그리고 노동자로 파견된 그 성격까지를 합쳐서 노동권에 대한 보호까지 중요하게 다루어야 한다는 것입니다. 북한의 군인을 해외에 파견하는 이번의 경우에도 일반 노동자로 해외에 파견하는 것과 사실 그 절차상에 있어서는 큰 차이는 없습니다. 북한 군인이나 북한 노동자 중 노동자들은 자발적으로 해외 파견을 선택할 수 있지만 군인 신분으로 파견된 남강건설의 군인들은 자의적인 선택을 할 수 없었습니다. 자신의 상급에서 어느 부대를 파견한다고 하면 그 부대 전체가 파견이 되는 것이고 그중에 일부 고위층의 권력자의 자녀가 있다면 그 정도는 예외적으로 파병 대상에서 빼주는 정도는 있을 수 있지만 적어도 군인 신분으로 파견된 경우에는 개인의 선택이 있을 수 없고 그리고 군인 신분으로 파병된 경우에 노동자로 파견된 것보다 훨씬 더 생명권 침해 위협이 높고 환경도 훨씬 더 열악하고 감시나 착취 구조도 더욱 심각할 수밖에 없는 것입니다. 또한 현장에서 이탈해서 탈출을 하더라도 노동자로 탈출한 것보다 이 군인의 신분으로 탈출하게 되면 러시아 측에게도 체포되거나 우크라이나 측에 체포되는 어떤 경우에도 사실 포로로서의 신분 또 그보다 러시아에 체포되면 탈주자로서의 신분이기 때문에 훨씬 더 열악한 상황에 처해지는 것입니다. 그래서 기존의 난민 지위와 보호 체계보다 훨씬 더 강한 처벌, 훨씬 더 북한 당국으로부터도 강한 탄압을 받을 수밖에 없기 때문에 이런 측면에서 국제인권단체의 보호와 지원이 현역 군인의 신분만이 아닌 노동자와 용병의 신분까지를 포함해서 좀 더 다양한 접근이 필요하다는 것이고요. 그래서 지금까지는 유엔의 안전보장이사회 그리고 유엔 인권이사회와 같은 안보와 인권을 주로 다루는 유엔 메커니즘이 참여하고 있지만 노동권을 다루는 유엔의 ILO와 같은 노동인권 문제를 다루는 국제인권단체들도 이 북한 파병 군인들 문제에 직접적으로 참여하고 개입하고 감시해서 이들의 군인으로서 신분만이 아닌 용병과 노동자로서의 어떤 그 권리에 대한 보호까지도 함께 다루어져야 한다는 것입니다. 적어도 지금 북한의 군인 신분으로 나간 이들이 체포가 되거나 또는 탈주해서 그게 포로의 신분이든 탈주자의 신분이든 국제법에서 정한 보호가 이루어질 때 개인의 선택, 그 개인은 한국행을 희망하거나 제3국을 희망할 수 있고 또 러시아와 북한 당국은 북한으로의 송환을 주장하는 상황이 벌어질 수 있는데요. 적어도 개인의 선택과 국가와 집단의 의무의 선택이 충돌할 경우에 인권의 대원칙은 개인의 선택을 우선한다는 것입니다. 그 개인의 선택을 우선해서 강제 송환도 금지되어야 하고 그 개인이 제3국행을 희망한다면 그것은 그게 포로의 신분이든 탈주자의 신분이든 그러한 선택이 우선적으로 유지될 수 있도록 하는 노력을 해야 하는 것이고요. 앞에 1세션에서 나왔듯이 그러한 선택을 심사받을 수 있고 선택의 기회를 주는 것도 중요하지만 그 선택의 기회를 받기 전에 우크라이나 전장의 상황에서 이미 생명을 잃을 것이다라고 하는 그런 우리의 목소리가 있었기 때문에 전장터에서든 체포된 즉시 북한에 파견된 군인들의 안전을 담보할 수 있는 사전적인 조치를 한국 정부와 유엔, 우크라이나 정부도 함께 노력해서 방법을 찾아야 된다는 것이 제가 1차적으로 발표하고 싶은 내용이었습니다. 나머지는 질문으로 답변을 하도록 하겠습니다.
네, 감사합니다. Now we're on to our final speaker. We began with Ukrainian civil society organizations, and we are ending our conference, our webinar with North Korean human rights civil society organizations. Our final speaker is Sokil Park. Sokil Park serves as the South Korea Country Director for Liberty in North Korea, an organization that has helped over 1,200 North Korean refugees reach freedom and safety. As well as overseeing Link's Seoul-based programs and operations, he works with North Korean defectors and experts to develop insights, analysis, and strategies to accelerate change and opening in North Korea. Sokil, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Hannah, for organizing this very important and timely conference. I'm going to talk here a little bit about some potential responses, particularly in the area of information operations and increasing political costs for Kim Jong-un. And the good and maybe bad thing about being the last speaker is that some of these points have already been referenced already. So I'll try and build on what the other speakers have already talked about. One thing that I would want to say at the top is that I think that people would already know, and we can also see through this deployment of North Korean soldiers to Russia, that Kim Jong-un does not really care about the loss of life of North Korean people, including North Korean soldiers, but he does care about the loss of control over North Korean people's information environment. In terms of what we can do, first of all, I'd like to kind of throw out some objectives. What I'm going to talk about here, I don't think is comprehensive. You know, this is a big topic, and you know, this is maybe the start of a conversation rather than the end of it. And so some of my suggested objectives would be, first of all, of course, to support Ukraine's defense against Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. Secondly, to prevent avoidable loss of life amongst conscripted North Korean soldiers that have been sent to support Putin's war. Just almost, you know, while we've been speaking, there's actually been reports from Ukraine of the deaths of a significant number, maybe up to 30 North Korean soldiers in the Kursk region. This is the first time I think that a report at that level has been put out there of the loss of that kind of loss of life of North Korean soldiers already in the conflict. That, of course, should be prevented if possible while supporting Ukraine. Thirdly, to the extent possible, I think that we should try and reduce the will to fight and increase surrender and defection amongst North Korean soldiers. Now, we've talked a little bit about that already, how it's difficult, but to the extent possible, I think that we should be looking for options to do that. And then lastly, in the long term, I think that this is very important. Again, is to increase the political costs for Kim Jong-un to continue supporting Putin militarily, especially through the deployment of North Korean soldiers. In terms of information operations, firstly, a quick note on target audiences. So I think that we can divide into three types of audiences. Firstly, there is the North Korean soldiers in Russia and in the battlefield. They may be difficult to reach, but it may be possible through use of leaflets and drones and so forth. It may be more difficult to reach North Korean soldiers than Russian soldiers, who typically may have had more access to personal devices like mobile phones. Secondly, I think we need to think about overseas North Koreans. Actually, Professor Yoon was just talking about different cases of North Koreans being sent to overseas to make money. There is a significant number. The UN panel of experts has estimated up to maybe 100,000 North Koreans sent abroad to make money for the North Korean government. So there's a significant number in China, Russia, and in several other countries as well. They typically have higher access to information than ordinary North Koreans, including many with some internet access. And a lot of them, as Professor Yoon mentioned, they may be tied to the military as well, or they may be coming from relatively more privileged families in North Korea. And so they're an important target audience. And then lastly, of course, the in-country North Koreans. So North Koreans inside the country that may be able to be reached more using radio and smuggled media. Then in terms of what kind of messages we would maybe want to try and get to these kind of audiences, and I won't be dividing this up by audience. I think that there's overlap. The first one, I think, is emphasizing that this is not a training exercise. This is a real war when many people have already died, and North Korean soldiers are in grave danger in this conflict. I would piggyback a little bit on Sung Yeon's point earlier, suggesting not just education on the reality of war, but the rules of war and rules of rules of conduct in war that Sung Yeon reported are very lacking in North Korean soldiers' education. Secondly, I think that we can emphasize that these North Korean soldiers are not fighting and sacrificing for their fatherland, for North Korea or the North Korean people, but the beneficiaries of this sacrifice and this risk are Putin and a small number of North Korean elites that stand to benefit from this deployment. Thirdly, I think that Songyeon also mentioned this a little bit as well, but talking about the financial compensation that soldiers are able to receive. If there is motivation, then a lot of it may be around financial compensation, but educating North Korean audiences that their financial compensation is likely to be small compared to what the Russian soldiers are getting, and also the benefits that the North Korean government is getting from this, as opposed to the soldiers or the family of soldiers being sent. Fourth out of fifth would be actually a little bit different. And this is the way that the Russian government and even ordinary Russians, I think, have largely a negative view of North Korea and North Korean people. That's in my experience and also in the experience of North Koreans that I know that have spent time in Russia. And in fact, if you think about, especially maybe the way that ordinary Russian people would think about North Korea and South Korea, if North Korean soldiers knew about that, if families and, audiences back in North Korea knew the kind of popular, perceptions, even stereotypes that, the way that Russian people think about North Korea compared to South Korea, I think that would erode North Korean soldiers' willingness to kind of fight, kind of on behalf of Russia, and can degrade trust between Russia and North Korea. And then lastly, the I Want to Live campaign has already been referenced, but I think that it is important to try and tailor this to North Korean audiences, to North Korean soldiers, and ideally saying that they have a choice of destination, including South Korea and potentially other countries if they do surrender. It's been mentioned how difficult it may be to surrender in the battlefield with the way the conflict is now. But as Songyeon said, there may not be that much kind of awareness of even the potential of surrendering or how you would surrender in the battlefield.
항복하는
And so
것이
the
실질적으로
practical
가능하지
information
않을 수도
on
있는데요.
what surrender is, how to go about surrendering,
이
and
항복을
trying
어떻게
to get
하면
that
할
to
수 있는
North Korean
것인지
soldiers
이것에
if
대한
possible.
실질적인 정보도 사실 필요합니다.
And then, lastly, in terms of where we can maybe continue some of these conversations, I think that, again, this seminar is really important, but I think that we can continue to have some of these kinds of consultations with former North Korean soldiers. I think that people like Ryu Song-yeon, they have a lot of great insights. We can learn more, collectively, maybe especially on the Ukrainian side, about North Korean psychology and military culture. Also, more options for information operations messaging, some of the cultural sensitivities that are going to be relevant. And then both in cooperation with former North Korean soldiers and also just South Korean groups, there could be, I think, assistance on creating simple literature or guidance on what the Ukrainian military should know about North Korean soldiers. I don't know how much this is going to be a factor. I have heard that if there are any kind of significant numbers of North Korean prisoners of war or any significant interaction between Ukrainians and North Koreans, there will be a significant language barrier. And so there could be cooperation to try and overcome that, including potentially using some kind of AI translation models for Ukrainian to North Korean. That could be trained and tested with cooperation with South Korean groups. And then lastly, I think that, again, in a little bit of the bigger picture, Ukraine and kind of alongside Ukraine, broader European support for informations into North Korea regarding the situation, regarding the war, and North Korea, Russia, and Ukraine kind of relations and situation. To wrap up, I think that what we see here is that Kim Jong-un has made a really big move to send North Korean soldiers to a foreign deployment, a foreign war in a significant way for the first time. And so that's a big risk. And I think that we need to try and turn that risk into a strategic error. Again, I don't think that he cares about the loss of North Korean soldiers. And so that won't be the key factor that makes this into a strategic error. But he will care about even a small or symbolic number of surrenders, defections, and challenges to his control over information and the narrative. So This, I think, is where we can create a big downside for Kim Jong-un. And I hope that we can make some progress on that issue together. And I also want to express my solidarity to our colleagues, especially in Ukraine, in dealing with this whole situation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sokil. I think we ended on some really great concrete action items on how we can go forward on this issue. We are due to finish off in a few minutes, but if it's okay with the panelists and our participants, I think we will leave it open for just one or two more questions before wrapping it up. We have one question that has already been answered by Songyeon, and one other question that I think potentially Professor Cho, or if any of the other panelists would like to answer, please feel to jump in. The question is about if South Korea does not regard North Korea as a separate country, and North Korean soldiers are considered citizens of the ROK under the ROK Constitution. From this perspective, how can the ROK bring a lawsuit against what is considered to be an anti-state organization such as North Korea that has deployed them? And given the fact that the South Korean government has not had any intervention regarding these individuals from a domestic South Korean legal standpoint, does this mean that North Korea is being acknowledged as a state rather than an anti-state organization? It's a very legal question. Maybe Professor Cho could speak a little bit on that.
예, 일단 대한민국 헌법에 의하면 또 여러 대법원 판례라든지 여러 그러한 일관된 법리에 의하면은 북한은 국가가 아니고 특히 형사법에서는 반국가 단체로 취급이 되고 있습니다. 그래서 만약에 혹시 북한 이번에 파병된 군인 중에 정말 제노사이드나 워 크라임스나 크라임스 어게인스트 휴머니티나 이러한 국제 범죄를 저질러서 우리나라에서 신병이 확보가 된다 그러면 아까 뭐 국내 재판에서 보편주의 말씀을 하셨는데 보편주의가 우리 ICC 그 이행 법률에 우리 대한민국 국내 법률에 제정이 돼 있어서 사실 우크라이나 군인이나 러시아 군인도 우리가 신병만 확보를 하면은 국내 형사 재판을 할 수가 있습니다. 근데 이제 북한군의 경우는 혹은 북한군을 파병한 북한의 그 당국자들에 대해서는 대한민국 입장에서는 북한을 국가로 보지 않기 때문에 보편주의가 갈 필요도 없이 속인주의, 그 퍼스널리티 프린서플이라든지 속지주의, 테리토리아 프린서플에 의해서 그냥 하면 되는 겁니다. 그러니까 뭐 보편주의까지 갈 것도 없습니다. 근데 보편주의의 근거도 우리 대한민국 국내 법률에 있습니다. 그러니까 국제 범죄 행위에 대해서는 대한민국 국내 형사 처벌을 하는 것은 어느 나라 국민이건 상관이 없다. 북한군이나 북한군을 파병한 책임자에 대해서는 속인주의, 속지주의까지 있기 때문에 더 자유롭다. 다만 그 신병을 확보하는 게 한계가 있을 뿐이다. 이렇게 말씀드릴 수가 있겠고요. 북한의 그 책임자들, 북한 당국에 대해서 민사상 손해배상 청구나 그러한 재판도 할 수가 있는데 같은 맥락에서 할 수가 있는데 다만 북한을 최근에도 국군 포로와 관련된 국내 손해배상 소송에서 뭐 이거를 번역을 어떻게 할지 모르겠어요. 비법인 사단 그래가지고 아무튼 국가가 아닌 어떤 실체로서 파악을 해서 형사재판에서는 국가보안법이나 이런 데서는 반란단체로 본 거고요. 민사 쪽에서는 그냥 비법인 사단이라는 비국가적 실체로 봐서 소송을 제기를 하죠. 그러니까 국가로는 양쪽 다 안 본 거죠. 예. 그 한국의 국내법 체계에서는 그건 일관 컨시스턴시는 있습니다. 이제 다만 이제 제3국이 우리의 이러한 입장을 존중할 의무는 없는데 왜냐하면 이거는 우리 헌법적 입장이니까 국제법적 입장은 아니기 때문에 국제 유엔 회원 멤버 스테이트로서 북한이 인정을 받기 때문에 제3국은 북한을 국가로 볼 수 있는 것이죠. 우리는 한국은 북한을 국가로 보지 않지만은 그렇기 때문에 아까 제가 대안으로 말씀드린 게 한국이 이런 관할권을 행사를 하는데 꼭 한국의 입장을 따르지 않더라도 최소한 이중 국적자로서 인정을 하면 우리한테 자유의사에 의해서 한국의 도움을 받고자 하면 우리는 언제든지 보호를 제공할, 이펙티브 프로텍션을 제공할 의지와 능력이 있다. 이런 말씀을 제3국 국민들한테도 좀 알려드리고 싶습니다. 예.
네, 감사합니다. We have two last questions. I'll ask them together, and I think this first question can be answered by Dr. Yoon and Sokil as well. What do you think South Korea or South Koreans can do to impact the situation to prevent participations of the soldiers in the first place? How do we prevent the North Korean soldiers from participating? So Keel or Dr. Yoon, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I could take a quick stab at it. I think that it relates to some of the things that I was sharing in my remarks. Unfortunately, there's not that much that can be done directly to physically stop the movement of troops from North Korea, into Russia. But I think that we can try and incur costs for Kim Jong-un for making that decision and potentially continuing to make that decision, continuing to send more troops. It's been reported that it's maybe around 10 to 11,000 North Korean soldiers that have been sent so far. It, of course, depends on what happens in the conflict, but 10,000 people could easily become 20,000 people. If this conflict is ongoing and North Korea's support continues,
그렇게 어렵지 않습니다. 만약에 전쟁이 지속된다면 그 파병된 북한군이
the initial kind of deployment. And so this is an ongoing situation that requires an ongoing response from the international community, including especially South Korea. And there are things that South Korea can do, especially on the information sphere, in order to incur costs. And again, that's about trying to challenge the North Korean government's control of information about this conflict and about this deployment of soldiers, to educate North Korean audiences on the reality of what is happening and who is benefiting from it, who is not benefiting from it, and to basically, incur political costs for Kim Jong-un. I think that would be the main thing amongst, there's not a great kind of slate of options for what the South Korean government or South Korean civil society and international community can do.
윤 소장님. 한국 정부나 한국 국민들이 할 수 있는 역할이 무엇이세요?
네, 사실 북한군의 파병을 한국 정부의 어떤 노력으로 막을 수 있는 방법은 거의 없을 것 같고요. 그거는 김정은과 푸틴의 정치적인 의지와 관계가 있기 때문에 이 부분은 미국 또 국제사회, 유엔, 나토와 같은 주변에 강력한 영향력을 행사할 수 있는 국가들과 함께 연대해서 그러한 방법을 찾아야 할 것이고요. 하지만 이미 러시아에 파병돼 있는 북한 군인들에 대한 영향은 상당히 저희들이 할 수 있을 겁니다. 1차적으로는 이 전쟁 범죄, 국제 전쟁과 관련되는 법률에 대해서 전혀 북한 군인들이 사실 인지하지 못하기 때문에 공통적으로 전쟁 범죄 또 국제법에 의해서 어떠한 보호를 받을 수 있는지, 특히 포로의 신분, 그런 부분들이죠. 그런 부분들에 대해서 우크라이나, 러시아 전장에 나와 있는 북한 군인들에게 직접적인 정보를 제공하는 것이 1차적일 거고요. 두 번째는 전 세계 공통적으로 군인에게 적용되는 보호 조치만이 아니고 대한민국 정부가 대한민국 헌법에 의해서 북한 군인들이 대한민국 국민의 자격으로 보호받을 수 있는 부분, 북한으로의 송환을 거부하고 한국행을 선택하면 한국으로 입국할 수 있는 충분한 가능성이 있고, 그런 부분에 대해서 한국이 우크라이나와 충분한 협의를 할 것이고, 한국에 들어왔을 때 어떤 지원을 받을 수 있는지 한국 정부가 선택할 수 있는 그런 부분들에 대해서 직접적으로 정보를 전달하는 것이 한국 정부와 우리 시민사회의 중요한 역할이라고 생각을 하는 것이고요. 한국 정부가 북한 내부의 정보 전달에 대해서도 많은 관심을 가져왔는데, 이미 북한 외부로 나온 러시아의 파병 군인들은 더더욱 그런 부분에 우선적으로 그러한 정보를 제공해서 합리적인 선택을 할 수 있는 기회를 제공하고, 그러한 선택이 실효적으로 작동할 수 있는 우크라이나와 정부와의 체계적인 접촉, 노력을 통해서 그러한 심사나 그런 기회가 보장될 수 있는 노력은 우리 정부와 충분히 해야 할 역할이라고 생각을 합니다.
네, 감사합니다. We will look at our very last question before wrapping it up. I think perhaps any one of our international legal experts, whether this is Professor Cho, Ilya, Natalia, or Valerie. We'll just have one response given our lack of time. But the question is, in response to DPRK's participation in the armed conflict between Ukraine and Russia, if South Korea would send the observer team monitoring mission to Ukraine, would that render South Korea a belligerent party to the armed conflict under international humanitarian law? Ilya and Natalia, go ahead.
I'll briefly say, I think that Ukraine in this situation would welcome any engagement of South Korea. We understand today a very complicated, like incredibly complicated political situation and expecting the change of the government. But I really think that that is a real situation. And I don't know what would be the, unfortunately, it depends on the political situation in South Korea, because unfortunately, this decision are driven by the, political views of various political forces. But Ukraine, for the last 2 years, demonstrated that it's ready to engage. It was rather Seoul was not really, cautious about any types of engagement. So I think in this regard, that would be a good start of cooperation. And the task is how to make it kind of bipartisan, apolitical, saying that, it's really about a very particular cause. Rather than the political story, and it shouldn't be controversial. So I think there is a task also how to make this issue less politically controversial, so it's not really debated. And indeed, like Ukraine would welcome any engagement, but there is a limit to how much Ukraine can do. The only obligation Ukraine can have really to protect the lives. I'm coming from the human rights world. I cannot guarantee how the prisoners of war are kept. What we know so far, they are kept in okay way, mainly, especially probably the attention, especially given to the foreign soldiers, because there is an interest of Ukraine to involve South Korea in some way. So we do believe that they might be treated okay if they get to the point where they are in the hands of the Ukrainian authorities.
Ilya, from a international humanitarian law perspective, a quick response?
Quick response is that it would depend on the modality of such a mission. I think that if it is a, let's say, peacekeeping or peace enforcement mission, then it would depend on that agreement, what's called usually the state of forces agreement, whether they will be mandated to use force. And normally they don't have such peacekeeping missions, don't have such a mandate, and so usually they're not considered as parties to the armed conflict, unless of course then on the facts the South Korean forces would be engaged in such hostilities, then they would be probably considered as parties to the armed conflict. But I would say it all depends on the type of agreement and then the actual modalities of deployment.
Great, thank you. We are just over our scheduled time, and I know there's a lot of further discussions and conversations to be had, but I want to just conclude today's webinar by thanking all of our speakers. We lost a few on the way, but thanking all of our speakers, our excellent panelists, for all of your insightful contributions, and our audience. We had a high engagement in this short period of time. Today we discussed the very complex issue of jurisdiction, issues of POWs, importance of those captured having the autonomy to decide themselves, and how to make use of this opportunity to protect North Korean soldiers as a way to hopefully end this war in Ukraine. And as I mentioned, we don't have all of the information, but what we do have is an opportunity to build solidarity amongst different communities. And I hope this can be an opportunity that we in South Korea, we are working in the North Korea space, are able to stand further in solidarity with our Ukrainian colleagues at this time. We hope this conversation marks the beginning of many fruitful collaborations. We have people joining us from Paris, from Brazil, from The Hague, from South Korea, from all around the world today. Let's continue to share ideas and work together to address these critical challenges. Lastly, NKDB will be sending out an issue brief that has been drafted by my colleague Unique and Dr. Yoon this week, which summarizes some of the stances that NKDB has. Again, we hope that this will be the opportunity to collaborate for concrete action items, many of them that was mentioned by my colleague Sokil. Thank you to our excellent interpreters, Amy and Heather. You've been fantastic. And thank you everybody again for joining. If you have any further questions, our email address and our website is up here. Feel free to engage with us in the future. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.